The sky was a dull gray as Adam pulled the car up the long driveway, the tires crunching over the loose gravel. The house loomed ahead, a hulking mass of stone and wood that looked more like an ancient relic than a place to start over. Its windows were dark, like eyes peering down at him and Lily, watching their every move. Adam tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. This was supposed to be a fresh start. He turned to Lily in the back seat. She sat quietly, her face pale, her small hands gripping her stuffed bear tightly. The bear was worn and faded, a relic of a happier time. He wished he could do something, anything, to ease the pain she carried. But no matter how hard he tried, Adam couldn't reach her the way he used to. Not since Susan died. "It's a big house, huh?" Adam said, his voice unnaturally cheerful, trying to break the oppressive silence that hung between them. Lily nodded but didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the house as if she could see something he couldn't. Adam forced a smile and got out of the car. The cool air hit his face, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. He popped the trunk and began unloading their bags, stealing glances at the house. It was larger than the pictures had shown, 3 stories tall with a wide front porch and towering windows. Once it might have been beautiful, but now it had an air of abandonment, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. "Come on, Lil," he called out, trying to sound more upbeat than he felt. "Let's go see your new room." She climbed out of the car without a word, still clutching her bear. Adam sighed. She hadn't said much since the funeral. Maybe this move was too soon. Maybe it was too much. But what else could he do? They needed to get away, to leave the memories behind. A new house, a new life. That was the only way to heal, or so he kept telling himself. As they approached the front door, it let out a long, groaning creak, as if it were reluctant to let them in. Adam winced at the sound, but pushed the door open, gesturing for Lily to go inside. She hesitated for a moment before stepping across the threshold. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the unmistakable chill of an empty house that had been waiting too long for someone to return. The main hallway was wide, lined with dark wooden paneling and framed pictures of people Adam didn't recognize. The ceiling stretched high above them, casting long shadows across the floor. A grand staircase curled up to the second floor, its banister covered in a fine layer of dust. "It's big," Adam said, his voice hollow as he set the bags down near the door. He wasn't sure what else to say. The place was overwhelming, even for him. Lily wandered down the hallway, her footsteps light and hesitant. She paused in front of one of the old pictures, staring up at the faded faces of strangers who had lived in the house long before them. Adam cleared his throat, trying to shake off the growing unease. "Why don't we check out your room? I bet you'll love it." But Lily didn't move. She stood there, her eyes fixed on the photograph. "It's quiet," she murmured, almost to herself. Adam forced a chuckle. "That's good, right? Peace and quiet. No more city noise." "No." Lily shook her head slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "It's too quiet, like the house is holding its breath." Adam frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, her face serious, far too serious for a 6-year-old. "I don't think we're alone here." His heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. She was just a kid, still dealing with everything that had happened. She probably felt unsettled. He couldn't blame her. Adam crouched down to her level, trying to meet her gaze. "Hey, it's just us, kiddo. No one else." Lily didn't look convinced. Her eyes shifted toward the empty hall behind him, as if expecting to see someone, or something, there. "They're here," she said softly, gripping her bear tighter. "They told me they've been waiting for me." Adam stared at her, the words lodging in his throat. Waiting for her. His pulse quickened, but he forced a smile, not wanting to scare her more than she already seemed. "It's a big old house. Maybe your imagination is playing tricks on you." She looked at him, her eyes wide, her voice deadpan. "No, Daddy. They're real. They said they want to be my friends." The words sent a cold shiver down Adam's spine. He opened his mouth to respond, but found nothing reassuring to say. He stood, running a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the creeping dread. "Well, let's get you settled," he said finally, hoping a change of subject might ease the tension. "You'll feel better once we're unpacked." Lily didn't argue. She followed him up the staircase, her small feet making barely a sound as they ascended to the second floor. Adam led her to her new room, a large space with a window overlooking the backyard. He had tried to make it welcoming, with bright bedding and some of her favorite toys already unpacked. "This is your room," he said, forcing another smile. "Pretty nice, huh?" Lily glanced around but said nothing. She walked to the window and looked out, her face pale and emotionless. "They don't like you," she whispered, so softly that Adam almost didn't hear her. He froze. "What did you say?" She turned to him, her expression blank. "The others. They don't like you. They said you don't belong here." Adam felt a rush of cold, like someone had walked over his grave. He stared at her, his mind scrambling for an explanation. "Lily, there's no one else here. It's just us." But she didn't seem to believe him. She just shrugged and climbed onto the bed, clutching her bear tightly. Adam stood there for a moment, watching her as she lay down, already curling into the blankets. His heart raced as he closed the door quietly behind him, leaving her in the unsettling silence of the house. As he headed back downstairs, the weight of her words settled over him like a thick fog. He tried to push it away, to focus on the task at hand, but the feeling of being watched never left him. The house was quiet, too quiet. And as Adam moved from room to room, unpacking their lives into this strange, empty space, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was waiting just beyond the edges of his vision. Something was watching. And it wasn't just his daughter. The first few days in the new house passed in a blur of unpacked boxes and uneasy silences. Adam had hoped the routine of settling in would distract him, would help them both adjust to life without Susan. But the house seemed intent on reminding him that this wasn't home. It felt like a stranger, its silence oppressive, its halls echoing with an emptiness he couldn't fill. And then there were the shadows. It started small, almost insignificant. A misplaced item here, a door creaking open when there was no draft. Adam tried to brush it off, tell himself it was all in his head. The house was old, and old houses creaked. Things shifted. But the feeling that something was off clung to him, a growing itch beneath his skin. Lily had become quieter, more withdrawn, spending most of her time in her room. Adam told himself she just needed time. Moving to a strange place, after everything they'd been through, would make anyone feel out of place. But Lily had begun saying strange things, and each time she did, a small voice in the back of Adam's mind whispered that there was something more to this house than its age. One night, after tucking Lily into bed, Adam lingered by her door longer than usual, watching her small form huddled under the blankets. She'd been so quiet lately, barely speaking to him, her eyes distant and filled with something he couldn't reach. He wanted to say something comforting, something to pull her out of whatever dark place she'd drifted to, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he muttered, "Good night, Lil," and closed the door softly behind him. He tried to busy himself in the living room, setting up the television and putting away the last of the boxes. But as the night deepened, the quiet became suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him, like it had eyes in the walls. The air felt too thick, too still. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled. Adam shook his head and turned on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out the tension in his chest. He flipped through channels absent-mindedly, not really watching anything, just trying to fill the space with something, anything, other than the gnawing silence. His eyes drifted to the window where the darkened yard stretched out into the night. A shape moved in his peripheral vision, and his heart leaped into his throat. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the empty hall behind him, dimly lit by the soft glow of the kitchen light. His pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out along his back. He stood, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the unease. It was late, and he was tired. He was imagining things. But as he reached to turn off the TV, he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible creak, like someone stepping carefully on the wooden floor just behind him. Adam froze. He turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning the hallway. The door to the kitchen was open just a crack, but no one was there. No one should be. Lily was upstairs, asleep. He was sure of that. He took a cautious step toward the kitchen, his breath shallow. The air felt colder, a sharp chill cutting through the warmth of the house. Another creak, this time from upstairs. His eyes darted toward the staircase. "Lily," he called, his voice shaky. No response. He climbed the stairs slowly, the weight of dread growing heavier with each step. As he reached the top, the dim hallway stretched out before him, and that's when he saw it. A shadow, long and dark, moving across the floor at the far end of the hall. But there was no one there to cast it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He blinked, but the shadow was gone. "Lily," he called again, louder this time. Her door creaked open slowly, and she appeared in the doorway, her small face peeking out. "Daddy?" Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a deeper sense of unease. "Were you just in the hall?" She shook her head, clutching her bear tightly to her chest. Number I was sleeping. Adam frowned, glancing back down the hall, but there was nothing. No shadow, no sound. "I thought I heard something," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Lily stepped out of her room, her face serious. "It's them," she said quietly. Adam felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. "Them?" Lily nodded, her voice soft but certain. "The others, the ones who live here." His stomach twisted. He had heard this before, her strange talk about the others in the house. He dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination, a way for her to cope with everything. But standing in the dim hallway, the memory of that shadow still fresh in his mind, he wasn't so sure anymore. "There's no one here but us, Lily," he said, his voice steady but strained. "You're just having dreams." She shook her head again, her eyes wide and serious. "No, Daddy. They're real. I see them all the time. They don't like you." Adam's mouth went dry. "What do you mean they don't like me?" "They said you're not supposed to be here," she whispered. "Just me." A sharp chill ran down his spine, freezing him in place. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Lily just stood there, staring at him with that same distant look, as if she were listening to someone he couldn't hear. Adam forced a smile, trying to push the fear down. "Let's get you back to bed, okay?" She didn't argue, just turned and walked back into her room without another word. He tucked her in and sat beside her for a long time, listening to her steady breathing as she drifted off to sleep. But even as she slept, her face remained tense, as though she were still listening to something he couldn't hear. When he finally left her room, Adam closed the door gently and leaned against it, his mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Stress, grief. The house itself, with its strange noises and drafty halls, was probably playing tricks on both of them. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The shadows, the footsteps, the way the house seemed to breathe around him, alive and watchful. And Lily, her words echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. "They don't like you." Adam made his way back downstairs, his pulse quickening with every step. He flicked on every light as he passed, filling the house with as much brightness as he could. But no matter how many lights he turned on, the shadows still lurked in the corners of his vision, flickering and darting just beyond the edge of sight. In the living room, he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV screen, but the unease never left him. Every sound seemed amplified: the ticking of the clock, the creak of the floorboards, the faint rustling of the wind outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that the house was full of unseen eyes watching him from the darkness. And then, in the dead of night, it happened again. The footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoing down the hallway upstairs. Adam sat up straight, his heart pounding in his chest. He listened, his breath shallow as the footsteps grew closer. They were coming down the stairs now, slow and steady, one step at a time. His body went rigid. He strained his ears, trying to make sense of it, but the footsteps were unmistakable. Someone or something was walking down the stairs. Adam stood, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a heavy candlestick from the mantel, and held it tightly, his knuckles white. He took a few cautious steps toward the hallway, his eyes fixed on the staircase. The footsteps stopped. He held his breath, waiting, listening, but there was only silence. "Hello," he called, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the creaking of the old house, settling back into its stillness. Adam stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, his heart racing, his pulse thundering in his ears. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he lowered the candlestick and took a step back. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe it was the house playing tricks on him again. But as he turned to go back to the living room, a shadow passed over the wall behind him, long and dark, moving quickly across the floor before vanishing into the darkness. Adam's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, but there was nothing there, just the shadows, always the shadows. Adam hadn't slept in days. The shadows had become constant, flitting across the walls and corners of the house, always just out of reach. Every night the footsteps echoed down the halls, and every morning he woke up drenched in sweat, the vague remnants of strange dreams slipping through his mind like smoke. He tried to convince himself it was all in his head, that the stress of the move and everything with Lily was getting to him. But deep down, he knew it was something else, something far more sinister. Lily had become more withdrawn, more distant than ever before. She barely spoke now, except to mention the others, always with the same calm certainty that they were real, that they were waiting. Adam tried to talk to her, tried to get her to open up, but every conversation left him more unsettled. One night, after hours of pacing the house, checking and rechecking the locks, he stumbled upon the attic door. It was hidden behind an old wardrobe in the upstairs hallway, almost as though someone had gone to great lengths to conceal it. The wardrobe had been too heavy to move during the first few days of unpacking, so Adam hadn't thought much of it. But that night, in a fit of restless curiosity, or perhaps desperation, he pushed it aside and found the small wooden door, the paint chipped and the handle cold to the touch. He hesitated for a moment. Something about the door made him uneasy. But then he thought of Lily, of the way she looked at him now, her eyes distant and filled with a knowledge she shouldn't have. She spoke about the house like it was alive, like it was watching them. He had to know. The door groaned as he pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. Adam grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made his way up the creaking steps, each one sagging beneath his weight. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, until it was so thick and frigid that his breath came out in visible puffs. The attic was large and filled with the clutter of lives long forgotten. Old trunks, pieces of broken furniture, dusty books. Everything was draped in cobwebs, as though the space hadn't been touched in years. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Adam shivered, though not entirely from the cold. There was something else in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the attic was alive with the weight of forgotten memories. He moved through the space slowly, shining the light over old photo albums and yellowed letters. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his heart raced faster with every step. Something was here. He could feel it. In the far corner, half buried under a pile of dusty blankets, Adam found an old wooden chest. Its surface was scratched and worn, the metal clasps rusted with age. His hand hovered over it for a moment before he unlatched it, his pulse quickening. Inside, he found old photographs, hundreds of them. He pulled out a handful, holding them up to the light. The images were faded and grainy, but as he shuffled through them, a sickening sense of familiarity washed over him. The families in the photos, they were all standing in front of the house. His house, smiling, happy. But it wasn't just the house that connected them. Adam's hands began to tremble as he flipped through the photos. The faces of the people in the pictures, they looked familiar, too familiar. His heart pounded as he stared at one image in particular. A family of 3, standing on the front porch, just like he and Lily had stood when they first arrived. The man in the photo had the same build, the same tired eyes. The little girl held a stuffed bear in her arms, much like the one Lily carried everywhere. Number it couldn't be. Adam blinked, his mind racing to make sense of it. These were strangers, just random families who had lived here before. That's all. But as he rifled through more of the photographs, the truth began to seep in, slow and cold. The faces, different families, different decades, they all bore a chilling resemblance to him and Lily. The men, the women, the children. Their expressions were the same, as though the house had somehow preserved them, trapping them in a moment just before something terrible happened. Adam's stomach turned as he stumbled upon the final photograph in the stack. This one was older than the others, the edges curling with age. It was a black and white photo, showing a man standing alone in the hallway. The very same hallway Adam had walked through countless times in the past week. The man's face was frozen in an expression of terror, his mouth open as if he were screaming. Adam's blood ran cold. The man in the photo, it was him. He dropped the picture, his breath coming in shallow gasps. It didn't make any sense. How could this be possible? He hadn't been in this house before. He hadn't lived here. He and Lily had just moved in. But the longer he stared at the old photographs scattered across the attic floor, the clearer the horrifying realization became. The house wasn't just old, it wasn't just haunted. It was repeating itself, trapping families in some kind of endless loop. Over and over, it brought new residents in, only to trap them in its walls, their lives slowly erased, their faces becoming part of the house's terrible memory. Adam stood there, surrounded by the photographs of long-forgotten families, the weight of the realization crushing down on him. His mind raced, searching for a way out, for an explanation. But deep down, he knew the truth. The house had claimed him and Lily. They were already part of it. They had always been part of it. His head spun, the walls closing in as the cold from the attic seemed to seep into his bones. He had to get out. He had to get Lily and leave this place before it was too late. Adam turned, ready to flee back down the stairs, but as he did, a voice drifted through the darkness. "Daddy." He froze. Lily's voice was soft, distant, as though it was coming from somewhere deep within the house. But she wasn't in the attic. She was downstairs, sleeping. "Daddy, they're here." The shadows shifted in the corners of the attic, and for the first time Adam saw them. Faint figures, barely visible, standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Their eyes were hollow, their faces pale and expressionless. Adam stumbled back, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. The figures stepped closer, and as they did, he recognized them. They were the people from the photographs, the families who had lived here before him, the ones who had disappeared. the ones the house had taken. They stared at him in silence, their mouths moving as if they were whispering, but no sound came out. His mind reeled, panic clawing at his insides. He had to get out. He had to get to Lily. The attic felt smaller now, the walls closing in. The figures were closer, their shadows stretching toward him, reaching for him. "Daddy?" Lily's voice was louder now, echoing through the house. Adam turned and ran, nearly tripping down the stairs as he fled the attic. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor behind him. But he didn't stop. He bolted down the hall, his breath ragged and shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. When he reached Lily's room, the door was ajar. He burst inside, his eyes darting around the room. But Lily was gone. The bed was empty, her stuffed bear lying discarded on the floor. Adam's breath caught in his throat. He rushed through the house, calling her name, searching every room. But there was no sign of her. The house was silent now, save for the faint whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves, the photographs, the shadows, the voices. Adam sank to his knees, his mind unraveling as the house closed in around him. They were already part of it. They always had been. The morning light filtered through the windows, pale and cold, casting long shadows across the floor. Adam awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest, the remnants of another nightmare fading like smoke. His throat was dry, and his body ached as if he'd been running for hours, though he hadn't moved from the bed. Slowly he pushed himself upright, his mind struggling to shake the heavy fog of sleep. Something was wrong. The house was too quiet, an unnatural stillness that pressed in on him from all sides. Adam glanced toward the window, the light somehow duller, flatter than it should have been. The shadows lingered in the corners, unmoving but watchful, as if they were waiting for him to notice. And then it hit him. Lily. He bolted out of bed, his pulse roaring in his ears as he raced down the hallway to her room. The door was slightly ajar, just as he had left it the night before. His hand trembled as he pushed it open. Her bed was empty. The blankets were pulled back, her stuffed bear lying discarded on the floor. Adam's chest constricted, panic surging through him. He called her name, his voice raw, but the house swallowed his words, offering only silence in return. He checked the closet, the bathroom, every corner of her room, but Lily was gone. She couldn't be gone. Not like this, not after everything. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tore through the house, shouting her name over and over, each cry more desperate than the last. He searched the kitchen, the living room, every inch of the first floor. He opened doors that led to nowhere, checked closets that hadn't been touched in years. But there was no sign of her, no sign she had ever been there. The walls seemed to close in on him as he moved from room to room, his steps frantic, his thoughts unraveling. The house had taken her, just like it had taken the others. Adam could feel it now, the weight of the place pressing down on him, its malice thick in the air. His mind raced, clawing for an explanation, some way to fix this, to make it all go away. Maybe she was hiding, playing some game. Maybe. A sound stopped him cold. Footsteps, not the faint, ghostly footsteps he had heard before, but deliberate, measured steps coming from the hallway just beyond the living room. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound, hope flaring inside him. "Lily," he called out, his voice hoarse, desperate. "Lily, is that you?" But as he stepped into the hallway, his blood ran cold. The figures were there again, the ones he had seen in the attic, the families, the ghosts. They stood at the far end of the hall, their pale, hollow faces turned toward him, their eyes wide and unblinking. They watched him in silence, their mouths moving in whispers too faint to hear. Adam's breath hitched in his throat as he took a step back, his eyes darting from one face to the next. They were closer now, clearer. Their expressions were empty, resigned, as though they had been waiting for this moment all along. And then he saw her. Lily. She was standing among them, her small figure dwarfed by the taller, ghostly shapes. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and distant. She wasn't smiling, wasn't laughing, just staring at him with that same hollow expression, as if she had already slipped away from him, already become part of the house. Adam's legs gave way beneath him, his knees hitting the floor with a sickening thud, his vision blurred with tears as he reached out to her, his voice breaking. "Lily, please, come here. It's me. It's Daddy." She didn't move. "Lily, please," he cried, his voice raw, his heart breaking. "Come to me." But she just stood there, her eyes locked on him, her lips parting slightly. "They're here, Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft, distant, like she was speaking from a place he couldn't reach. "They said we're supposed to stay." Adam shook his head violently, the tears streaming down his face. "No, you don't belong here. We don't belong here. This isn't real, Lily. We need to go." But the shadows deepened, swallowing the edges of the room, and the figures moved closer. Their whispers grew louder, filling the air with a low, mournful hum, like a song that had been sung 1,000 times before. Lily stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate. Adam reached for her, his hand outstretched, but she didn't take it. She stopped just out of reach, her eyes locked on his, her voice a soft, haunting echo. "They said it's our turn now." The words shattered something inside him. He lunged forward, but his hands passed through her like smoke, the cold seeping into his bones. She was slipping away, becoming part of the house, just like the others, just like him. Adam's scream tore through the silence, but it was swallowed by the house, absorbed by the walls that had already taken so much. He fell to the floor, sobbing, his fingers clawing at the air where she had stood. "Lily, please." But there was nothing, only the cold, the shadows, and the ghosts that had been there all along. The house had claimed them. Time passed, though Adam couldn't say how much. Hours, days. It no longer mattered. The house had fallen into a deep, eerie silence, the kind that pressed down on him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The light through the windows grew dimmer, weaker, until it felt as though the house was drifting into another place entirely, a place where the living did not belong. He wandered the halls, calling her name, but there was no answer. The photographs on the walls, the faces, had changed. The smiling strangers who had once filled the frames were gone, replaced by new faces. His face? Lily's? The latest victims, their expressions frozen in time. Adam stood before one of the photos, his heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. The realization hit him like a slow, crushing wave. They had never been the new residents. They had always been part of the house, always trapped in its endless cycle, forgotten and absorbed into its memory. He turned away from the photograph, the house echoing with a hollow silence. Somewhere, deep within its walls, he could still hear the faint sound of Lily's laughter, a distant, ghostly reminder of the life they had once had. But it was gone now. As Adam walked through the empty halls, the shadows closed in around him, and the house exhaled a long, slow breath. The door to the front of the house creaked open softly, as though welcoming its next visitors. And the cycle began again.